Good morning, welcome. I'm Georgia. I'm the solutions consultant at Nice Media, and I also do these webinars quite a lot. So I'm excited to say that this is episode 4 of 4 for the video production for L&D series. So we started this series last year, and we've covered every stage of the production process across that series. So the first one was about pre-production. We've done one about creative concept development, and this one is obviously about post-production. And then there was a cheeky one in the middle there that was all about Tom's new book, Watch and Learn. So all of those were recorded and are available online. So I'm going to be creating an article about them all, so I will send that out to everyone as well. But as I said, this one is all about post-production, how to nail the edit stage of a video learning project. And we've condensed our thoughts into 15 post-production tips. So you will have my input as someone from a producer background, Tom Hickmore, who is founder and creative director at Nice Media, and has worked on many hundreds, potentially thousands of video learning projects. And Vasil, can I call you Vas?
Yeah, you can.
Vas, who is a freelance filmmaker and editor and has done a lot of work with Nice. And Vas and I actually know each other from our training day, shall we say. We both did the same MA in documentary at Sussex. So between us, we've got a lot of years of experience, and we're really glad to see you all, because we essentially want you to learn from our mistakes so that you don't have to make your own. And we hope it will be really, really handy. So we'll finish at 11:30 at the very latest. We want you to be as engaged as possible. So we'll be launching some polls throughout. So please do just tick box exercises, just a few questions for you to kind of think about. And also there's a chat function. So I can see that a lot of you are already saying good morning, which is lovely. And please feel free to use that to ask us questions as well. And if the question relates to what we're talking about in the moment, I will feed it in to the conversation. And if not, we'll save it to a Q&A section at the end. So I think that is probably everything on the housekeeping. Obviously, we can't see you, but you can see us. So yeah, if you do have any thoughts or questions, do just drop them into that chat. So before we jump into the 15 points, Tom is going to talk to you about why we edit. So Tom, over to you.
Yeah, I thought it was a good idea just to give a little thought to the fundamental reasons of why we edit. At one level, you might say it's to get rid of the rubbish bits, but more meaningfully, the reasons to create meaning and tell a story. Originally, of course, someone had to work out how to tell stories in film, and one of the pioneers was the Soviet filmmaker Lev Kuleshov, who did a famous experiment in which he filmed an actor making an uninflected expression, and he cut that next to a bowl of soup. And then he asked the audience what they thought his expression was showing, and they said hunger. He then used the same shot of the actor and cut that next to the shot of a beautiful woman, and they perceived his expression to be lust, and so forth. So what was demonstrated was that the juxtaposition of uninflected images creates a meaning in the mind of the viewer. And this is the basis of film language. Language cuts create meaning. I think it's interesting that people often get excited by special effects and techniques that draw attention to themselves, but this right here is a kind of magic that goes unnoticed, really. And the other aspect, of course, of post-production is compositing, which is joining together layers of assets such as presenter and graphics.
Excellent. So I think one thing that I'll say is that throughout this discussion, we're going to be talking about lots of different types of video. So we'll definitely be talking about drama, but we'll also be talking about other types of learning content. So whether that's talking heads or presenter-led content or drama, and cuts play a role in all of those types of content. So it's very rare that you have a one cut piece. So cuts have different functionality depending, and that will kind of come up throughout the conversation. So let's move on to our points. So you'll see in the kind of like red in the top right, we've categorized our points, and we're starting with pre-production because there are points in pre-production that massively impact post-production, and they are well worth considering. So the first point is to know what you want. And this involves agreeing as much as you can in advance of a shoot and the edit. So Vas, let's bring you in. You haven't spoken yet.
Yeah, I haven't spoken.
So tell us a little bit about your thoughts on the importance of knowing what you want.
Well, I kind of think of it as putting a train on some tracks to get to a destination. So you have to lay the tracks so that the train can actually move to where you want it to go. And in using that kind of not very good metaphor, what I guess I'm trying to say is that I kind of think of it as working backwards from the deliverables or the end product that we're all trying to make. So whenever anyone speaks to me about a project to start with, I like to ask them all the questions in advance. What are we making? What we're actually delivering? I guess what shape that takes. Is that going to live on a website or on social media? Is it going to be just rectangular, or is it going to be also square and tall rectangular for stories and things like that? So I think making a list of the end products really helps you kind of get on track right from the beginning. And what I would say is getting things right in the first place is actually much more efficient than relying only on post-production to kind of get there.
Yeah, I think, that's definitely a key message today, isn't it? Don't think that you can fix everything in the edit, despite how great the technology is these days.
I mean, it's a kind of a weird kind of magic that happens in the edit, because you've got lots of people's work that comes into focus and kind of actually creates the thing you're making for the first time. But all these elements have to be thought out beforehand so that they can work as a whole in the end.
That makes sense. And Tom, can you talk a little bit to, so Vas is talking about working backwards from the end product, and in terms of learning and e-learning, there are some specifics that we need to think about as well, aren't there?
Are there?
so things like overlays I'm thinking of. So when with video learning content, they're often situated within some kind of e-learning platform.
Exactly, yes. Sorry, you've anticipated. Yeah. So, for example, you might have subtitles that are going to come up, and then you may have interactive elements so that when a video stops, for example, you get a question that comes up, and that might clash with where you've put another graphic in the video. So, or even the framing of the video, you might end up putting some, it's unavoidable to put it in a sort of a nasty place in the frame. So it's good to try and consider all that from the outset.
I think a presenter. Sorry, go on, Tom.
I was only going to say, and also the other thing is that sometimes in e-learning, not so much nowadays, but you still have videos that are delivered as quite small in the frame. So that's good to know about in advance, because you would film that differently. You wouldn't. The frames would generally, the shots would generally be tighter, closer to the subject.
Definitely. Vas, I know you're about to say something, but I've moved on to point 2 because
fine.
I think it relates.
Shall we get to it?
I think it's going to relate, isn't it? So this is starting to touch on scripting. And that's why pre-production is important for post-production, because our editors also work from the scripts that have been produced early on. And it's a set of instructions. That's exactly what a script is. And you need, the less assumptions you make, the clearer you are, the easier production will be and the easier post-production will be. So Vas, can you say a bit about that?
I mean, I guess there's 2 ways of thinking about script, and one is thinking of it as what's being said, and that is definitely part of the script, a very major part. But the type of script that I quite often get to work with on non-drama productions, for example, also includes what we see and what we hear, and any special effects. So it's in essence a 4-column table. So what that gives me is...
Can I just say, we got some examples there?
Oh yeah, we'll do, yeah.
Here's one,
Yeah, so when I get that, obviously together with the conversation I have with colleagues, I can see exactly what is happening at any point, what assets need to be brought in, and there are basically no surprises when information is presented that way, because you know all the elements that come into it. But obviously that is requiring quite a lot of thought in advance. So I think it's a good good exercise to do for anything that you're making. I guess drama is a bit different, Tom. Obviously we can't use this. I mean, I guess we can, but not in the same shape.
What about the other one? Go to the next one, if you don't mind, George. I think that's more what Vas is talking about at the moment, because that's a presenter script there, isn't it?
Yeah, so with the presenter script, obviously the middle column is exactly what the presenter will say, and then the far right hand column is the images that will match what's kind of being said at any
and you can have an extra column for graphics, where you can say what kind of overlays are coming on. If it's a very graphics heavy project, how are they coming on? What kind of style? You can have references. If you're working with color as well, you can have kind of palette and all sorts of kind of handy information. But what I'm trying to say is, if you use this format to communicate to an editor, there will be very little room for misinterpreting anything, because it's just such a simple but powerful way to do stuff. And in terms of other scripts, I think there are some tiny little details that sometimes evade the initial scrutiny of a script. And kind of things that I'm thinking of is pronunciation preferences. Obviously, that has to do with either American and British or Australian English and so on. But also how we say foreign names. Are foreign names appropriate for the context? Are they definitely double checked to be a male or a female name, or a name that's used across the board, so to speak? And also abbreviations. That is also quite a contentious point quite often, whether we like something to be used in an abbreviated way or in its kind of full kind of sprawling pronunciation.
Yeah.
So I'll just talk a little bit to the drama thing, shall I?
Please.
Just to say, yeah, with drama, this is the kind of script format that we prefer. I mean, there are several, but they all have these basic elements, which is basically description, the character name, which must be consistent, parentheses, which are usually speech directions, the speech, and that's pretty much, those are the main elements. But one does find, a lot of people in e-learning don't know about this stuff, and the very simple things that we don't get. Actually, what you don't get quite often is very simple things like the location, because at the top of the thing you need where the setting is and the time of day.
Yeah.
And even those things are missed off, and character names are often inconsistent. People sort of, and the other thing to think about is that things are very often filmed out of order. So the descriptions have to be sort of concise, but also sort of self-contained. And often those it's assumed because you've read the previous page or something, you'll know what's happening in this scene, which is, so what we're really doing is, it's a set of instructions, isn't it? And those instructions have to be used when you're filming under a lot of pressure, and so they have to be very, very good and usable.
To segue nicely into point 3, obviously the scripting stage is where you're deciding how different video elements will complement each other, and a key principle in general, but especially in learning, is to not overload the viewer. And because if too much is going on at any one time, then that will interrupt the ability to take in that information. So Tom, can I ask you to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Yeah, so the great thing about video is that you can deliver 2 streams of information simultaneously, visual information and audio information, usually in the form of voiceover. One example we're all familiar with, of course, is David Attenborough's voice running alongside some footage of wild animals interpreting what we're seeing. Where people often go wrong is with the addition of text to this mix, because voiceover uses the same processing bit of your brain as interpreting written text. So very soon we get cognitive overload, and there's been experiments by Mayer, for example, that have demonstrated this. An exception would be language learning, of course, where words are the objects of the narration. If you're set on using keyword graphics, you've got to make sure that they're really pithy and short, and that they use exactly the same terminology as the voiceover, so that there's no conflict there. And you don't refer to, for example, say higher education, while the voice says colleges or something. And there's also evidence to suggest that background music can inhibit learning. So go easy on that if you're making learning content.
Excellent. Thanks, Tom. Point 4. I'm just going to assume that this is your favourite point, Vas. Vas likes to be involved early on in any project.
It's part of being nosy, I guess. I don't need to know things from day one as such, but the earlier I kind of get a chance, a call, or otherwise to discuss the whole project, and not just the specifics that relate to me as such. I like to start the conversation with knowing what this project is about, who is it for, what is the function of the material that we're actually making. Is it for learning? Is it
Hold on, has everyone got a pen? You need to write Vas's list down now. So this is me.
No, I mean,
carry on. No, it's a good list.
I think it's good to know what it is well before I actually start working on it, because I think, at least I believe, that subconsciously the brain starts on some level to think about different elements of that production, even if you're not actually on it for, let's say, another 5 days or something. So I'd like to know about the project in general. I'd like to know what we're delivering in the end, even if it's something that will be reiterated or changed later. And then I'd like to know some very specific things about the production process, such as what cameras are being used, what acquisition format and codec is being used, just the specifics of the actual video being recorded, and any needs for graphics and compositing. Am I going to be working with 4K footage, or even 6K, or even 8K footage? And also, I kind of like to see if anyone has seen any benchmarks or examples that I can find useful in the meanwhile. Just to start the thinking process in my head. And also, physically to prepare, if I need to prepare my system, if I need to get additional software, or in a rare instance when this project is not for me, so to give me a chance to say this is actually a project for a motion graphics person rather than for myself. Just
to back you up, Vas, I've got to say that it is always really helpful to talk about a project early on with you as the editor, because it does make you also think about how you're approaching production. So yeah, definitely support that whole idea.
I was going to say one more point. Even simple things like what Tom was saying earlier about positioning the present. Literally, if you have a presenter video, how do you position the presenter in the frame? And then I would ask, are we doing any keywords on the screen? And if you do so, then perhaps the wide shot would be off center, so we allow ample space for keywords to pop up. Just kind of like, it's just going through the motions to make sure that nothing gets forgotten about.
Absolutely.
And I guess for your side of things, Georgia and Tom, is another opportunity to kind of run through the whole thing with someone else, someone new.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, so this is quite a complex example of that kind of situation. So Tom put together this video. I'm going to play it, Tom, and let you kind of explain as it runs, if that's okay.
Yeah, so this was, excuse my ridiculous acting, if you call it acting, gesturing, whatever. This is just a test for some green screen work that we did in the office. And this is the kind of thing that you might give an editor in advance and then say, here we've done a bit of compositing, sticking some graphics that we just got off the internet in the back, and it's obviously to work out how well it's going to work with a moving camera, green screen and moving camera.
So, and that was obviously through discussion with the editor in terms of what would happen if it was shot in a particular way, and that was a really important exercise actually, because it impacted how the team have gone on to decide to shoot the project, which is actually happening next week. So that one's hot off the press.
Yeah. So it gave the editor something, they could have an experiment with it, and also gave the director the right information so that he could film it in the right way. You couldn't do it handheld, basically. You had to do it on tracks, is what it amounted to.
I think with anything to involve green screen, I think any amount of testing is never a miss. It's always good to try things because things like putting the target marks on the green screen and so on. You might think you don't need it, but actually you do. So useful exercise always.
Definitely. So we're going to move on to point 5. I think this is our last one under the kind of pre-production category. Consult relevant people from the start. So this is really important, because what you don't want is to get to edit stage, show someone senior a version of a video, and they disagree with the fundamentals of the script, for example. So it's a really obvious point, but what's not always obvious is who exactly you might need to consult with. So we've got a poll that's just been launched, just to ask you kind of who you would normally need to involve. And that hints at the range of people that you might need to involve in the process, depending on the type of content. So we've obviously got legal there, branding and marketing. There's some overlap there, obviously, and then more senior colleagues who will, could veto an entire project, for example. So Tom, and I mean, we always encourage our clients to do this from the beginning, but Tom and Vas, do you have anything to add to this point?
It's surprising how many elements a different part of a large company or organization can find problematic if they hadn't been consulted to start with. And obviously, as you say, it's sometimes we have to be reactive just because things arise and we have to kind of deal with them. But I think it's nice to give different departments a say in case there are, let's say, developments in branding that you might not know of, or if there is a specific way you need to refer to certain, I don't know, like certain legislation or people or anything to do with the actual subject of video that has been changed or is new. And marketing, I think, as a team, always have something to say as well, because they might want to run a long-term line of how things look and feel. So they might want to kind of, I guess, have their input to start with rather than reactively later. And I think it just makes everyone happy to be involved.
Definitely.
There's a bit, actually, we've actually got it in our notes in the future-proofing bit, but I think it's worth saying it now, which is about involving branding, because branding to me is the people who come in really left field and you can't understand why on earth they're worried about things. I can't anyway. But so I had an experience, for example, when I filmed in a room with a client logo on a big screen, and very attractively we had it reflected in some glass tables, but it turned out that this broke brand guidelines to show it the logo also up to side down and back to front. So we had to reframe all the shots in post to the detriment of quality, and that this was all for an internal piece. So you think they wouldn't be quite so kind of full on about the branding, but they were. So
excellent. So moving on to point number 6. So you can see the category is now production. So these are things that you can do in production that will help you in the edit and post-production. And the first one is to shoot in 4K. And there are pros and cons to shooting in 4K, but these days it's mainly pros, is what we'd say. And the cons are more like considerations. So Vas, sorry, from an editing perspective, what's the value of shooting in 4K rather than HD?
Well, it just gives you more freedom in the edit as such, because if you are delivering what you're making in HD, which is, let's call it 1K, you have ample space to zoom in or zoom out of the footage to kind of draw attention to certain parts of the picture. It allows for cutting if you've framed the wider shot.
I'm just going to interrupt there, Vas, just to we better explain the difference between HD.
Oh yeah, let's
and
start.
4K, just to be very clear.
Just to be clear, 1K is, let's say, your standard 1080 by 1920 pixels picture, and 4K is basically 4 times the amount of pixels you get within the same frame. So basically, you have much more, as a larger canvas, I guess, to play with. And when squishing it down to deliver back into HD, we have basically the result of this downsampling is better quality. The sharpness is usually better. There's less artifacts like noise or other kind of like unpleasantness in the footage. So it's basically just a larger canvas of the same footage. I think, is that explaining it well? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
That's great.
But what that gives us is basically bigger amount of pixels, literally numerically, to play with. And that helps with cutting, because we can actually make, out of one shot, we can make 2 shots. Let's say if you film something in a medium or a kind of medium wide, then that would be your wide shot. And then because you have that extra amount of pixels, you can zoom in or crop in or punch in, and then you can have another shot size, which would be, let's say, a close-up. And that will allow us to actually cut when, let's say, someone fluffs up, if it's a more simple video, or, as Tom explained, for kind of like meaning-making purposes as well. It also allows adding movement, artificial movement. It's not as good as actual physical movement in camera, but we can add slow zoom in, zooms out, slides, and so on. I would say it's also better for cross-platform content. So if we're making something that will end up not just as a 16:9, let's say, website video, but also as a square for Instagram, or even as a stories, or any other kind of shapes and sizes, 4K will allow us, usually, if framed right, the extra real estate, so to speak, to frame things differently. Because if you've ever tried to reframe a video shot with the intention of rectangular to try to frame it for Instagram stories, you are always searching for that extra height, because it just isn't there. And finally, I would say it helps for compositing. So the previous test that Tom had done for the green screen, the more pixels we have in green screen projects, it is always beneficial, because it will result in nicer, cleaner edges of where the green, or the stuff that we take away, meets the stuff that we retain. The downsides, I guess that's more of a, as Georgia says, not so much downsides as considerations. The files are bigger. They copy slower on location, so we need to allocate more time for that. And they require bigger storage, which is, I guess, an added cost.
That takes us in nicely. I think that's a great summary, Vas, and I think that takes us nicely into ditting files and backing up files at the location. So obviously, bigger files equals it does take more time. So, you know, I think all of us have had the experience where at the end of a shoot day, we can't go home because we're sat watching a blue line travel slowly as files transfer onto multiple hard drives. So that is, you know, that's why it's good to do a DIT during the lunch break, for example, or any other breaks, just to kind of take the load off the end of the day. Also with ditting on location, it's a safety thing as well. So by backing up your files at the location and having multiple copies, likely going home with different people in different directions, it means that you are much safer. Because I think when we were talking about this in advance, Vas described, I've got a quote from Vas where you said, split the copies for security because they are corruptible, breakable, losable, and muggable, I think we all heard. So it's really important.
There's probably more words that can go wrong in that way.
There probably are, but that's a great 4 anyway, just to get the sense of the importance of having multiple.
It is the most expensive day of the whole project, literally, in terms of the resources that go into it. And the product of a whole day's work is usually a tiny little card with some data on it. So I think this is where my fears live. This is the stuff of my nightmares, basically, is losing footage or getting footage kind of like corrupted because of not following the right procedures. And therefore, I think ditting, apart from serving extra functions on bigger projects, so the DIT would be also responsible for monitoring the quality of the image in its most basic form of data wrangling, I think is of utmost importance to nominate someone, hand the responsibility to them so they are responsible for that, set them aside a little bit away from the production and let them take the time and attention to copy things in separate places, make sure the integrity of the data, and then hand it over to once the producer, once someone else who's kind of senior in a production, to keep separate copies in separate places.
We should just say what ditting is. We haven't actually said what DIT
stands.
Yeah. DIT is digital information technician or transfer. I'm never quite sure, but you can. But if you are a DIT, you're a digital information technician. That is a job in larger productions, and that's all you do. It's just take care that all the information that's been digitally recorded is backed up and is safe.
And
so DITting is obviously transferring it.
It's worth being thorough about. If you do it in any lesser way than what Vas just described, do so at your own peril, because it is, like you say, it's all of the work on some very small devices. Okay, number 8. So we love this one. So avoid the classic, we'll fix it in post. And as far as we're concerned, if you hear someone say that on set, an alarm bell should start ringing, because it can't be the default position. It should be very much a last resort. So, Tom, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, because obviously, when we'll fix it in post is something we all occasionally say when, like a mic pops into the top of the frame, or there's a door slammed halfway through a speech, so it's in a gap between speeches. And then, if you're experienced, when it's sensible to say this. On the other hand, the phrase has become kind of emblematic of poor quality control during filming, because ideally we seek to create assets that are, peach perfect, and that we know will slot together nicely in the edit suite. And that's, all that careful planning and execution and being rigorous.
Yeah, there's unavoidable things that will have to be fixed in post, as in if you're doing a really wide shot and there's no other way to fit 3 cameras shooting at the same time, and the mic will pop from the top of the frame into the empty space above someone's head. We know that's absolutely fixable because it's locked off and we know of it, and that's fine. But sometimes it's as you say, it's a sign of laziness, if anything, or sometimes just pressures being put on the crew. But what I'd say is re-recording a take takes 5 minutes, and fixing something in post will most likely take an hour at least, sometimes a day. So if there's time to just run it once more, even if it's just a segment of the whole thing, it's always better to do it than rely on the old adage. I never know how to say that word. It's not an adage. It's a misnomer, because it's false economy. Fixing it in post.
Brilliant. Thanks, Vas. That's great. Thank you, Tom. Okay, so we talked about this a little bit earlier about future-proofing your content. So I was hoping that you could both just talk about how you can future-proof, because there are different elements associated with that.
Funny enough, one of them actually is if you filming a drama, sometimes, because we seem to film a lot of white studio dramas, which is to some extent it's a budget thing. It can be quite productive in a studio, but the other thing about it is because it's sort of set in this abstracted kind of setting, obviously things go out of date less. It looks more high level, notional what you're doing, and I think in that sense it's there's a bit more shelf life in some dramas. I think it's a wonderful example.
Yeah, I was thinking along the same lines of just avoiding temporal or time markers, such as it could be like, buzzwords like Brexit or the pandemic, or sometimes mentioning the year. Any of that kind of stuff, I guess, would date a production quite quickly, because believe it or not, we've kind of moved on from Brexit. Any content that has that in, you immediately think 2016 to 18 kind of time. I guess also technology, that is something that gets dated. If you see an iPhone 4, you'd know that's an old thing, because it looks very different. It's just sparing a thought about how to bring this content to, because it's an investment. So how can your investment live for longer? Just requires, again, a little bit of thinking of what props and what is being said.
Tom, anything to add? I know we've had a project, haven't we, where we had to completely strip out any element of a brand that appeared in.
I think we probably should have brought that up earlier in the I forgot what other section it was, but we had something when someone They wanted it very branded, and then they changed their mind again because of branding. Said didn't want it to show the branding because it was a sort of it was a contentious subject matter, and if these little drama scenes got out into the wild, they didn't want it sort of associated with them, even though it was educative about these contentious subjects. So we had to go right through the whole thing and strip out all the branding, which was quite difficult, although I was actually amazed at how far technology's got, that it actually wasn't as expensive or time consuming as I thought it would be, but nevertheless, it's an extra chunk on the budget. So things like this, like that logo on a t-shirt, we had to take that out.
I mean, I guess that there's a point to be made about branding altogether in terms of future-proofing, because companies will inevitably update their branding, and often you say, oh, that's not our current logo, that's the old logo, or that's our old font, and so on. So I guess not over branding is always a good idea, like unless you really need it to be branded to do with the content being made. I think branding is better left as a graphic added on to something.
Agreed.
Later on.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's one of the biggest things that people end up having kind of problems with, isn't it, in terms of future proofing? So definitely agree with that. If you can avoid using branding, then do.
Might get fun enough, you can also surround it by branding in the eLearn.
Yeah.
And then the video maybe doesn't have so much branding, or it's just like the colors or something like that.
So we're going to move on to point 10, and you can see that we're now in the post-production category as we hurtle towards the end of the 15 points. We will have a short Q&A at the end. So if you start to have any questions, please do pop them in the chat and we can kind of gather them up for the last 5 or 10 minutes. So in terms of post-production, have a post-production schedule. I'm a big fan of a schedule. It's on every level. But yeah, these are important documents. It doesn't mean that once you've written a schedule, you have to completely stick to it. Obviously, these things can evolve over time and life happens and things need to be changed. But it's a really important piece of information. So Vas, can you talk a little bit about scheduling and why that's important for you from an editing perspective?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, things are iterative or, changeable and flexible to a point, but the whole process is sequential, as in we still, even though we can meander, we still need to do the same amount of steps, pretty much in the same order, for most efficiently finishing the edit. Obviously, everything can always be completely undone to these very basic parts again, but that would be very inefficient and costly as well. So scheduling obviously allows me to allocate my time appropriately and to kind of slot the activities that I need to do in parts of the schedule. And we usually have rounds of amends as part of the schedule. So the biggest chunk is usually spent on making the first version of what the client sees. Then they see it, and then they have some amends or comments, and then we do another round, and so on. So having these dates in advance and knowing those allocated pieces of time is really useful, so I can basically do as much as I can in them. And I think, sorry, go on.
I was going to jump in and just add that by the same token, the client has a chunk of time to feedback, and we like to make sure that you've got all of those dates in the schedule in advance so that you can plot it into your calendar and know when you're going to be required to look at versions of the video so that you can give it the full attention that it needs, because you've literally plotted out that time. So what we don't want is to be delivering you a version and you're not expecting it, and we need feedback because we've got resource on it the next day, so that's it. It's an obvious point, but sometimes it's worth stating the obvious, I think.
Yeah, and another little point is about version 1. So obviously a lot of attention goes to the project at any point, but I guess it's most critical to pay attention to version 1, because this is when we have the most opportunity to change things more drastically. So the better the communication between me and through the producer to the client about the first draft, the more we can achieve with it. Just again, because the process is sequential, so to speak. So I guess what I'm trying to say is if you're going to pay attention to reviewing one version, the most of that attention should be for version 1.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thanks, Vas. Okay, so number 11. So this is quite a convoluted point, but where she says potato, please can you change it? So she says potato. And then the answer is often no. And then, okay, yes. Because I mean, depending on the genuine, reality, the answer is more. It can be more no or more yes. So we have had an example of someone involving a senior stakeholder far too late in the edit stage with a drama, and then saying, where she says that whole section on that thing, can you change it so that she says this other thing that was never even in the script and therefore was never recorded? And the answer is, well, we cannot defy physics, so the answer is a definite no to that, unless you would like us to go and shoot it again. But there are smaller things where, as you can probably imagine, the technology does allow us to make changes. So Tom and Vas have got loads of examples about this kind of thing that they've worked on historically. So I don't know who wants to go first. Vas, can you maybe tell us a bit about that, when you've had to add and remove things? And
what in terms of sound?
Yeah, let's focus on sound a little bit.
Yeah, let's focus on sound. Yeah. So whilst, as you say, we can't conjure up sound that has not been recorded, we're not deep fake makers. We can still look in the other takes for little words to replace. So if, let's say, one word sounds a little bit chewed up and not entirely clear, what we can do is look for another mention of that word along the script and along the recorded takes and swap it for that. But sometimes it's a bit of a kind of doing like a graft patch, because it has to be the right intonation. It has to have the right inclination at the end. So, you can't take a word from a question and put it into a statement sentence. So it is kind of tricky to do with the available material. And that's the first step. Obviously, in films, you have dialogue replacement a lot due to how films are made. But then again, it's a budget and time consideration as well. And when this fails, kind of rummaging through what we've already recorded to try to find something to save the word, then when this fails, we can do dubbing involving the actual actor. But I think Tom has more recent kind of...
I just did one the other day, actually, which is pretty much what Georgia described, that, we had a late change to the script and said we couldn't change it. We didn't refilm anything, but we took the cast into a dubbing studio. We re-edited the film, took them into a dubbing studio, re-recorded, because if you change one bit of voice, you've really got to record all the other voice from that scene, because it's never going to match if it's a significant chunk of it. So we had to redub it all and then add this new voice, and then sort of have a shot of the back of that person's head while they're saying that new line, this kind of thing. And that costs, a couple of £1,000 or something to do that for one scene. It can be done, but it's not an optimal thing. So that's just And then shall I say the ask example, Georgia?
I'm actually wondering about the one about the proximity of the actors more than that one.
Oh yeah, okay. Well, we had another
interesting.
one where we had the clients obviously watching the monitor as we're filming, and we try and say, this is the shots, this is what you're going to get, this is roughly how it's going to cut together. Let's try to get people to understand how it's, but then after it has all been shot, we got the feedback saying, as man and woman can't be sitting that close together, because that will be seen as too intimate in some countries, like Muslim countries, for example. And so we just couldn't use the wide shot, so we just had to use two singles in which which were like clean singles, so they didn't show the other person wasn't fringing in the side of the frame. And we just couldn't use a wide shot. So it's a bit of an odd scene the way we cut it, but it did work, but it was a bit, not optimal again.
Brilliant. So it just shows what is actually doable, but how an understanding of that or a mention of that early on would have impacted how you shot the scene on the shoot day. Yeah. Brilliant. Sorry, that was the response to the question about potato, so I'll move on from that. So point number 12, won't stay on this too long, but this is the After Effects versus Premiere and Premiere Point. So obviously there are other softwares available, but this is about the fact that they are two different things, and not all editors are After Effects pros as well. It's usually the case that they can at least dabble in it and can do the basics and stuff, but After Effects is, some people are motion graphics experts and that's what they focus on, that's what they do. So it depends on the project and what you're trying to achieve. And the difference is important. So Vas, can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm just going to briefly basically try to make the distinction that one is Premiere is where we assemble stuff in a more traditional kind of way, and After Effects is visual effects software basically, and compositing software. So obviously, as you say, there's certain expectation that editors can do certain tasks in After Effects, but I think particularly when motion graphics heavy projects are handed to someone, it should always be to someone who is comfortable with both. And if they're not, as I do, I sometimes just say that's too much for me. I think this better goes to motion graphics person, because this is mainly motion graphics and not so much story building in a more traditional sense. However, I think most editors are expected to be able to composite, which is to, let's say, get rid of green screen and replace it with stuff. Also expect to do some basic titles. That's the kind of thing. Or tracking is also another thing, which is kind of like most people can do. But I think it's just not taking it for granted is the main lesson here.
What's tracking?
Well, tracking would be following the motion of a shot or an object in the shot and attaching things to it. Let's say you sometimes see it when, let's say, there's a big swooping shot into a hillside and there's a big text kind of like moving with the shot, and we move through the letter O, and this requires tracking. And that's one thing that, if it's simple, an editor might be able to do it, but if it's more complicated, then probably best to get someone with that competence.
Thank you, Vas. That's great. And Tom, I'm going to ask you to talk a bit about transcriptions. I've said here, your new best friend. Transcriptions are a really handy tool. Can you explain what we use and how we work with transcripts?
Yep. Videos based on talking heads surprisingly are scripted, but only scripted in terms of what people want to say in a conceptual sense. So you don't put words into people's mouths. And then, of course, when you film it, you usually get extra material that you hadn't even thought of. So by far the way to edit this kind of content is to create a transcription and work with that. And the tool that we use at the moment, mostly for it, is called Trint. It's an online tool that creates an AI transcription, which naturally has some inaccuracies in it, although those are easy to correct as you go through the material. It offers you the ability to do word searches. You can see the text highlighted as the video is played back. You can edit and reorder chunks of the text, which can then be viewed as video playback of people speaking that text, in a reordered way. You can download Word documents and so forth. And of course, you can also use the system to create subtitles. Plus, of course, we can share all that with the client, and they can look at it and make notes on to actually see the text of what people are saying.
Brilliant.
Comment back on that in that way.
Yeah, so yeah, very, very useful. Just to say, we are nearly there. Thank you for sticking with us so far. We've got two last points, one main point really. We just had to have a 15th because it was on the marketing. So the 14th point is about feedback being consolidated, clear and specific. So it's often the case that, and I can see that quite a few of our clients are on the webinar today, and so you'll know about how we, what one person is usually expected to be responsible for gathering feedback from all of those stakeholders and presenting it to us in a consolidated way, so that your decisions are clear about what you actually want, rather than potential contradictory feedback from different people within the organization. There are technical approaches to giving feedback that are really, really helpful, and tools that you can use. And then there's obviously just general kind of approaches which are really handy and more efficient. So We've just launched the poll as well. You can see about which aspect of providing feedback do you find most difficult. And obviously the point about feedback from colleagues is getting a lot of votes there, which is completely understandable, because sometimes a lot of negotiating has to go on to make a final decision on those things. But yeah, so Vas, can you say a little bit about tools that we use and what's really valuable for you to help the efficiency of the edit?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, the most basic tool that we use is a table. Surprising. I just love tables. And to me, what is most important to me when deciphering the feedback is that I have maximum clarity on the intention behind the feedback, because I want, same as the client, I want to achieve what we all want. So the more information I have, or the more detailed information I have, the more detailed my work will be in terms of implementing that feedback. So basically, sometimes obviously it's very difficult to gather different stakeholders' feedback. But even if it means going through it and deleting some stuff that is no longer relevant, or expanding on something that is not entirely clear, that is always a welcome thing. Time coding is also a welcome thing, particularly for things that have lots of different moving elements, let's say graphics or text. And the most basic way to do that is put it all on a table, from 3 seconds to 5 seconds. When presenter says, "I love cats," change the color of the background. Love it. But if it's just, sometimes with Vimeo perhaps, even though it's an amazing tool, if we just click on something and say wrong color, then it will be much more difficult for me, and I have to ask follow-up questions, which will slow down the whole thing. So I guess what I'm trying to say is more information is better than less in feedback.
Specific information, I think.
Yeah, I'd rather have more than necessary or overly wordy, or what you might think of, teaching me to suck eggs or whatever. I'd rather that than not enough, so to speak. And what I would say is, I think for drama, I find the more traditional feedback methods better, such as just a table or bullet points, time coded, of course. But for things that are more to do with graphics or moving elements on the screen, Vimeo Review Tool is perfect, because you can actually click on an element. Let's say on the slide, I can click on that red panel and I say, no, that's not our brand red, change that. So I think it depends on the project.
Thanks, Vas. Yeah, that's great. Tom, anything to add on feedback? No? Okay, so number 15, or kind of tokenistic, but also very important final point, is about kind of just enjoying the process and enjoying it when the plan comes together, because it makes all the difference when you do have that plan in the first place and you follow that process. Do we have any questions? Not many have popped up in the chat, so it might be that we are almost done. And I know we've been pretty thorough in terms of the detail of how we approach post-production. Thanks again to everyone who's attended. It's been a really good turnout, given the time of year and everything. And we have recorded it. We will be putting it online, and we'll send a copy to all of you, or a link to all of you, in case you want to share with your colleagues as well. And in terms of our future events, thank you for answering this poll at the moment, because that will definitely inform kind of the direction that we go in with future content and future webinars as well. And finally, just to say thank you, Tom and Vas. That was really great for you to distill all of your experience into a very short amount of time. And if anyone has any questions after this for any of us, please feel free to get in touch, because we're always more than happy just to have a conversation, because we love talking about these things. We really do. If you haven't already heard about this book, I bet you have. I'm likely to have been in touch already. Please do look it up. It's written by Tom Hickmore, published last year, and is a very useful handbook for anyone who is involved in producing drama in learning. And last one is, if you haven't heard of this already, which again you should have, What Can TV Teach L&D? Tom's series of videos. I think we're on season 3 at the moment. Is that right, Tom? It is season 3 or 4.
Three, I think.
Season,
Yeah.
yeah.
About,
so
movies the next season. Yeah. Just
yeah. Then and we've got, I think, The Shawshank Redemption and Jaws and Finding Nemo. Is that right?
Finding Nemo. Yeah.
The classics. So yeah, these are great. You know, if you're into TV drama or movies, you know, you'll really enjoy those. But yeah, please do get in touch if you have any questions in future. And otherwise, thank you very much, and all the best for the rest of 2022.
Thank you, Georgia.
Thank you, Georgia.
Thanks, guys. See you soon.
Thanks, everyone.